I'm going to start by just welcoming everybody, thanking you all for coming. It's just so exciting to, I mean, it's exciting when we have people here in person and we get people in a room, but there's another kind of excitement bringing in people from literally all over the country, and both speakers and alumni, and in Gordon's case, a former professor. So thank you all for coming. I'm sorry that you don't get to taste muffins in person, but I had to show a picture. We have a lot of good talks. This is our first one for the semester. Just wanted to, quickly show you that we've got lots of good ones coming up. Today's going to be fantastic as well. And let me introduce our speaker. Oh, before I do that, for questions, what we've decided that if you have a question, sign on to the chat and say, I have a question. And then at the end, I will call on you, ask you to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question. Okay, we're going to try to see how that works. But in the meantime, I'm really happy to introduce Seth Kellogg, who was one of the first students that I taught at Alfred. Gordon and I taught her both. She was a Geology and Environmental Studies major, graduated in 1994. Later got a MS in Geology from Indiana University. She has 25 years experience in investigating and remediating contaminated sites in New York and New Jersey. Very hard for me to believe that someone I taught has 25 years experience, because that makes me feel really old. She's very active in the National Groundwater Association, and recently briefed Congress on the state of PFAS, which I'm sure she will tell us a little bit about, science and policy. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over so she can hopefully share her screen.
Okay, can you see the slides and hear me now?
I can see the slides and hear you. It is showing the next slide, but it's not showing notes or anything, so I think it should be fine.
Okay, so it's not showing the title right now?
Oh yeah, no, it's showing the title and then it's showing the little piece of the next slide, but that's fine. So.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's what I was worried about.
Yeah, it shows you sharing. Can you share the I don't know.
Let me see if I can.
There you go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Is that just the slides? Okay, awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming today. I think this is going to be a really interesting presentation, and it's something I've had questions about for a while. So I appreciate you indulging me talking through this with everybody. But I've been working in the environmental world with characterization and remediation for about 25 years. And we keep talking about emerging contaminants and what the next big thing is going to be and what's going to be the next regulatory driver. And I have yet to really understand how that all worked and came together. And over the last, I guess, 5 to 8 years, I've been working a lot on PFAS. And PFAS is one of those compounds that they keep talking about as an emerging contaminant, and that we really should regulate, and that the states are taking the lead on. And so I use this talk as an opportunity to kind of dig back into how we really regulate individual contaminants and what the process is to make all that happen. So let's see if I can get my screen to change. So we're going to talk through a little bit of the history and the regulatory framework, how the United States at the federal level regulates contaminants and what that means for different pieces. Then we'll talk through some contaminants of emerging concern, which is the new buzzword. So it's not that the contaminants are new, it's that the concern is new. And then we'll talk about a couple case studies, specifically perchlorate and PFOA and PFOS, and how those contaminants are moving through this process. So we're going to start with the Clean Air Act. This was the first major environmental act back in 1963. It required that the federal government and states both regulate stationary and mobile sources of pollution. And it was the first major law that had a provision for citizen suits. So it was intended not just to have EPA be the regulator and run around and keep track of everything, but it really was designed to have individuals be able to monitor what was happening in their environments and act on that. And that was followed pretty much after, in about 10 years later, by the Clean Water Act. And, you know, everyone talks about the Clean Water Act, and there's the picture of the boat in the Cuyahoga River on fire. But the Clean Water Act was really put in place to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So the Clean Water Act does not address groundwater at all. I guess there has been a recent court decision in Maui that says if you can tie groundwater contamination directly to surface water contamination, it can be covered under the Clean Water Act. But it separated surface water from groundwater and put groundwater in the court of the state and basically put all the regulation for clean surface water into the federal government's bucket. And it does also provide a provision for citizen suits. So then we get to like the law that really has teeth. So in 1974, the Safe Drinking Water Act was put in place. And it's intended to ensure that everyone that is served by public water has safe drinking water. The EPA is actually required under this statute to set drinking water standards. And it actually has significant oversight authority and a lot of power to fine water suppliers that don't implement this law correctly. It also allows for states to promulgate their own additional and more stringent maximum contaminant levels. And interestingly, it does not apply to bottled water. So bottled water is actually regulated by the FDA, and that is a completely separate, and it's not as stringent, which I thought was interesting. So I apologize for the small text on this, but basically this is the process of setting a maximum contaminant level through the Safe Drinking Water Act. So the first thing you have to do is determine how much of the contaminant can be present without having an adverse health effect, and that's the MCLG. In a lot of cases, the answer to that is 0. So if you look at a lot of compounds that we currently regulate, the preference would be to not have them in our water at all. But the second bullet talks about how EPA is permitted to choose that maximum contaminant level based on the cost of treatment and also the public health benefits and available technologies. So for the case of perchloroethylene or trichloroethylene, basically what EPA did was they said, we don't want any of that in our water. There is no safe level. However, what the laboratories can see is 5 parts per billion, and that's about what we're comfortable spending money on to clean up. So that's where we are. And many of those standards that were put in place back in the 70s and 80s haven't been revisited or updated, or they haven't evolved with the available technologies. So under the Safe Drinking Water Act, EPA has to consider 3 criteria when they're regulating compounds. The first is, does it have an adverse health effect? And the second is, does it occur in enough places at high enough concentrations that if we regulate it, we can actually have an impact on public health? And you'll see as we talk through the presentation that those 2 criteria are met quite often when we're talking about contaminants of emerging concern. However, the third one is necessary, and it's really more of a political than a scientific judgment. And then that one is in the sole judgment of the administrator, basically, is this worth doing? And that'll come into play later on. So again, this is an eye test, but I wanted to share so how does the Safe Drinking Water Act decide what to regulate? And what they're required to do is every 5 years, they have an unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, UCMR, unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. So every 5 years, they get to pick up to 30 compounds which can be chemicals, they can be biological, they can be pharmaceuticals, and they can go out and tell all of the water systems to collect samples for these. And that basically checks off that second box. It allows them to know if the contaminant is in enough public water systems that if they regulated it, it would actually have an impact on public health. What you'll notice is that none of these compounds repeat, and most of them haven't been regulated yet. So MTBE was in UCMR 1 back in 2001. It's still not regulated by the EPA. PFOS, PFOA, they were in the 2012 UCMR 3. They're also still in the regulatory process. So of all of these compounds that they've looked at, only perchlorate made it as far as having an MCL proposed. So the next law that came along was the Toxic Substances Control Act. And Congress really had this overarching vision for how we were going to enact environmental laws. So basically what they were trying to do is say, we need to regulate what's going into the environment, what's coming into the commercial and manufacturing and industrial sphere. And that's what TSCA is supposed to do. And then RCRA and CERCLA, which are coming next, will follow those compounds through and make sure that they end up where they're supposed to end up. So TSCA basically addresses the production, use, and import of any chemical that's used that doesn't fall separately under an FDA jurisdiction. And in this case, there are 86,000 or 83,000 chemicals that are in the TSCA inventory. These chemicals are not actually investigated by the EPA. What the EPA does is it collects exposure and risk data from manufacturers and assumes that they are telling the truth. And so, and that information that they collect from manufacturers is confidential business information. So it can't be shared with researchers, it can't be shared with, under Freedom of Information Act, anything. So basically, the EPA looks at what is provided by the manufacturers, says yes or no, this can go into significant use, and passes these through. And this law was not intended to slow down commerce or the economy in any way. It really was, it is written in a way that it is relatively, the bar to get something into commerce is relatively low. So then we get to RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And again, this is guided by the idea that there is no such thing as contamination. There is only a resource that is not in its proper place. And so really what this was designed to do is be a cradle-to-grave approach of disposal of hazardous waste and solid waste. But it is the most complex environmental law that we currently have, in that it doesn't regulate specific compounds. It regulates waste that come from specific manufacturing and industrial processes. And it also regulates characteristic waste. So you can have a sample, or you can have 2 buckets of water that have exactly the same characteristics and have exactly the same concentration of a chemical, and one is considered hazardous and one is not, based on where it came from, what the industry is, what the location is. And that makes it very complicated for a lot of people to implement this law correctly. So, and then we get to CERCLA, which is the big fun one, I think, that has driven most of the environmental industry for the last 30, 40 years. There are 40,000 Superfund sites that have been identified under CERCLA. About 1,600 of them are on the national priorities list. And this law was really designed to allow the federal government to clean up hazardous waste sites when there wasn't a responsible party that existed. What's interesting is that there is no single uniform cleanup standard under CERCLA or under Superfund, but the cleanups must be protective of human health and the environment, and the remedial actions have to be relevant and appropriate. So applicable and relevant and appropriate requirements. So this again is where things get complicated. So the first thing you have to meet under CERCLA is that your requirements are applicable. So let's remember that the only place in all of our federal laws that has any numbers that you can apply to cleaning stuff up is the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so in many cases, states have extended those MCLs to include groundwater. And in some cases, they haven't. But there are no standards for soil, for air, for groundwater, for biota in any federal regulation. And so in a lot of cases, we're falling back to state regulations. And in some cases, states don't have regulations. So states are actually prohibited in their environmental laws from extending anything beyond what is in the federal regulations. So it does make it very challenging if you're trying to implement these programs in New York or Kansas or Oregon or different places, because the applicable and appropriate requirements change depending on physically where you are and what jurisdiction you're in. So then the last one I wanted to talk about was the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. And this was really meant to encourage emergency planning and provide public and local governments with information about the potential chemical hazards that are present in their communities. So basically, after Superfund hit and we had these 40,000 sites and everyone started saying, I mean, Jim Bob's junkyard is a hazard to me, and it really raised a lot of community awareness. So first responders and individual towns really wanted to know what the businesses in their locales had and what they were using it for. So the federal government implemented EPGRA and the toxic release inventory. So as part of the TRI, you're required to report up to 767 compounds. And again, remember that under TSCA, we've got 83,000. So under the TRI, you need to report up to 767. And on top of that, you also, it's all driven by the amount of material that you have. So some chemicals, you have to report any amount. Some chemicals, you only have to report if you have over 10,000 pounds on, so if you have isopropylene, you only have to report to your town if you have over 10,000 pounds on your facility. So it, again, gets complicated. So then the last piece in how these contaminants emerge and how we really think about it is litigation. And over the last 30 years, a lot of our understanding and a lot of the remediations that have happened have really been driven by either citizen suits that were filed under the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, or this concept of natural resource damages. So on this slide, the upper right-hand corner is the Deepwater Horizon response, and the bottom is, identified cancer clusters. And so basically with the Deepwater Horizon, because it was a petroleum spill, petroleum is not included under hazardous substances in any of our environmental laws. So natural resource damages was the way that states and localities basically forced the responsible parties into cleaning up and remediating a lot of the impacts from the Deepwater Horizon. And the same thing happens with these citizen suits when you identify a cancer cluster and basically groups hire attorneys to help them get damages from different responsible parties based on environmental releases. So just to review the universe of federally regulated chemicals, under TSCA, we start with that 83,000. Under RCRA, we end up with listed or characteristic waste. So you can kind of debate on how many that really is. Under EPGRA, reporting 767. And then under the Safe Drinking Water Act, we actually have numbers for 78 chemicals. So there are actual real numeric regulations for 78 of the 83,000 chemicals that are currently approved for use. So then in that universe, how do we go about identifying contaminants of emerging concern? And a lot of this falls to public health and local environmental advocates. So in the case of natural resource damages, if you are a member of the river keepers, if you go to the same spot every year or every 6 months and you take pictures and you can document changes in bird migration patterns or changes in ecology, that's a really good way to drive these discussions of contaminants of emerging concern. There again is a lot of litigation. So there are groups that are basically dedicated to litigating different environmental impacts and getting responsible parties to remediate those. And then there's also research and new laboratory techniques. So over the last 40 years, as we've implemented these laws, our technology has gotten better, our research has gotten better. And we have a much better understanding of not only the toxicological impacts of individual compounds, but mixtures of compounds. And we have DNA tools that we didn't have 40 years ago. So a lot of that new research is informing our understanding of risk for a lot of these different compounds. And if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, the other piece that's key to these contaminants of emerging concern is that they actually have to have a human exposure. So in many cases, you can identify something that is highly toxic, but if you don't have a complete pathway to an actual human exposure receptor, that isn't considered an emerging concern. So as long as you maintain whatever toxic substance you have outside of anything that would be impacted, that's not a candidate to be regulated. So I wanted to talk through a few different examples of emerging contaminants. This one, pharmaceuticals in the environment, or it's also referred to as PI, really gets into the environment by human waste, by improper disposal of expired or unneeded drugs. I've actually worked on a site in New Jersey where the levels of Valium in the groundwater are therapeutic levels. It also happens to be located next to Pleasantville, which you can take that for what it's worth. But, in a lot of cases, these pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities, if they had a bad batch, it just went to the landfill. And there are a lot of uncontrolled disposal techniques that happened prior to environmental regulations that really, that we're still cleaning up. And again, we're just not looking for a lot of these compounds because it's not within the universe of what is currently regulated. Pharmaceuticals have been tied to, gender changes in fish. They've also been tied to antibiotic-resistant pathogens and different die-offs of amphibians and fish kills. I think that, the other thing that is very interesting is the wastewater industry is very interested in a lot of these emerging contaminants, and they're very concerned about pharmaceuticals in wastewater and then having that end up in our water supply. So that's definitely an area of a lot of research right now. I include personal care products because pretty much everybody uses them, and there's almost no research around them. So US EPA has defined them as contaminants of emerging concern, basically because there's no understanding of what the human health risks are when they're released to the environment and the ecosystem. We have seen some interesting cases where regulated materials have found their way into common everyday personal and household products. So 1,4-dioxane is an emerging contaminant that is regulated now in the state of New York and the state of New Jersey. That is a byproduct that's found in detergents. So a lot of septic systems and wastewater treatment plants have been identified as sources for 1,4-dioxane. So you have, again, a lot of these fragrances, cosmetics, over-the-counter drugs, veterinary medicines, things that just happen to end up in our landfills, our septic tanks, and our wastewater treatment plants. And we don't really have a good idea of exactly what the human impacts are. The next one is microplastics. And this one is a little bit more convoluted. And I'm not sure how we would tie it to our existing regulations. you know, human exposure is pretty much from airborne dust, drinking water, and, you know, consuming primarily seafood that has been exposed to microplastics. And the plastic itself is relatively inert from a toxicological standpoint, but there are a lot of additives in plastics that impact the color, the flexibility, the rigidity, the heat resistance, the UV resistance, and all of those chemicals can have human health impacts. Plastics are also really good for binding to things. So heavy metals and organic contaminants in our water bodies can end up binding to these microplastics and end up in the human body. And then lastly, we'll talk about endocrine disrupting compounds. And this is kind of the catch-all when it comes to emerging contaminants of emerging concern. And basically, this is anything that has been identified as having an impact on human hormones or our metabolism or our endocrine system in general. And I think what's interesting about this is the messaging around endocrine disruptors has been incredibly successful. So you'll find that, you know, phthalates and BPA and a lot of the other chemicals that are identified on this slide have already been removed voluntarily by manufacturers because people have identified that they are potential concerns. So this is one case where public pressure has circumvented the environmental, the need for environmental regulation, and has really pushed some of these chemicals out of favor and out of use because of the attention that was paid to them. So I do want to talk about a couple of different case studies. The first is perchlorate. So perchlorate is a naturally and man-made ion. Basically, it was used for fertilizers and other products, so it can be found quite often in the food supply. And it's also used as a propellant in fireworks, in airbags, and basically it's really great for rocket fuel. I'm working on a site right now where they used to take a paper bag of the stuff and throw it into a blast furnace to get their, to melt their metals and treat their ores. So it was a very useful chemical, and it can be used in electroplating, disinfectants, and herbicides. The downside is that perchlorate blocks the ability of the thyroid to take up iodine, which basically makes it impossible for the thyroid to work. The thyroid regulates metabolism. It can be particularly impactful to infants and fetuses. And so when we're talking about that list of things in the Safe Drinking Water Act that we need to check off to make sure that we are meeting the spirit and the letter of that law, in this case, we know that it has adverse health effects. And by the UCMR1, we know that it was found in 26 states and impacted 16 million people through their drinking water systems. So it was included in UCMR1. The EPA developed a health advisory level and then followed by a proposed maximum contaminant level under the Safe Drinking Water Act in 2011. Many states actually promulgated their own drinking water standards, New York and New Jersey being two of them. California and Texas, you don't think of Texas as being one of those incredibly environmentally progressive places, but because of all the NASA facilities that they have and the rocket fuel that was used there, perchlorate is a huge issue in Texas, and they did develop their own MCL for that. And so basically from 2001, when we started UCMR1 to 2012 or 2011, it was a 10-year period before we even proposed a maximum contaminant level for this product or for this contaminant. And then in July of 2020, the US EPA administrator decided that it doesn't actually, it won't actually provide sufficient health risk reductions. And so he decided that MCL is not going to move forward. So perchlorate will not be regulated. And if we ever want to regulate it again, we basically have to go back to the UCMR stage. So it's not like, the next administrator can come in and say, oh, no, we really did want to do that. Now, I don't want to pick on the current administration because we've had several administrators between 2011 and 2020 that also haven't acted on this maximum contaminant level, but it does show how politically vulnerable a lot of these laws can be. So the other case study that I want to talk through is PFAS. And you know, PFAS, which are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, is pretty much what I've spent the last 8 years of my career working on. It is a family of over 4,700 chemicals. All of those are included in that 83,000 chemicals under TSCA. And right now, the federal focus is on 2 chemicals in particular, PFOA and PFOS. So PFOA was primarily used for stain resistance. So this is your stain master products, anything that you wanted to keep grease off of. It's also very prevalent in fast food wrappers. And then PFOS is known for aqueous film forming foams. And it is, again, incredibly useful and effective when it comes to putting out fuel fires, at least liquid fuel fires. And it was developed for the military specifically to be used on board ships. So these products are compatible with both saltwater and freshwater, and they can put out a fire in 30 seconds. So it's designed to make sure that the airplanes and the bombs that are on your big boat don't blow up while you're trying to put the fire out. So these chemicals are pretty incredible and designed to do exactly what they were supposed to do. So how do we think through our understanding of these chemicals? So, you know, first in the 1930s and 40s, these chemicals were developed actually as part of the Manhattan Project and were really critical. I mean, they're bulletproof. They're almost impossible to destroy. So they were critical to us being able to develop nuclear weapons. They were also expanded in the 1950s and 60s to stain-resistant products and AFFF and packaging. So we found that, you know, these things, they resist grease, they resist water, they resist heat. They're absolutely brilliant. Let's put them in everything, and let's use them for everything. I mean, your cell phone won't work without them. So the makeup that floats above wrinkles won't work without them. So they really are ubiquitous. Starting in the 1970s, we started detecting high levels in the blood serum of workers and consumers. So really, in the 1970s, we knew that this was going to be an issue. That was followed up in the 2000s with a citizens suit where the manufacturer of PFOA was sued by a group. And basically what they won was a health study. So they spent almost $300 million on a study of over 80,000 people to identify what the potential health impacts of these particular chemicals were. And that pretty much resulted in EPA saying, pretty please, will everyone that makes this stuff in the United States voluntarily choose not to manufacture it here anymore. And so manufacturing these 2 specific compounds were phased out in the US in 2015. And then there's a typo on that. It should say 2020, not 2012. But as of 2020, we don't manufacture these in the US anymore, but we do import these chemicals in finished and raw products. So, and what you'll see on the right-hand side of this screen is really this drift towards lower and lower contaminant criteria where we think that there are human health impacts. So we really did start at that 1 part per billion level back in the 1990s. And now we are down at the 10 to 14 part per trillion level. So the acceptable concentrations for human health have dropped, or our understanding of those concentrations have dropped by 2 orders of magnitude over the last 20 years. And that again is primarily driven by the C8 study. You know, these are specific health issues that they identified associated with the study. What's interesting about PFAS is that it tends to bind to proteins rather than fats. So if you think of PCBs or a lot of other bioaccumulative compounds that are challenges for us to deal with, we tend to think of them being lipophilic. So they partition into the fats in the human body. In this case, for PFAS, they actually bind to proteins. So they affect men more than women. And they have very specific target cancer rates that are more associated with men than women. So basically, they found a threefold rise in the number of kidney cancers and a 3-time rise in the number of testicular cancers associated with PFOA in the C8 study. So what do we do with this information? You know, and right now, the only tool in our toolbox is this drinking water toolbox right now. So when you look at the pathways of concern for PFOA and how we're driving these different risk assessments, you know, you can see that produce and food and fish are essentially an order of magnitude higher in the amount of daily loading of these chemicals than drinking water is. And inhalation and dust and fish consumption are essentially on par with the drinking water standards. So that's part of why when you're looking at the state of New Jersey and you're going, or the state of New York, and you're saying, why are we at 10 parts per trillion for this? It's because in their risk calculations, they're assuming that only 20% of your daily load of PFOA is coming in through drinking water. But again, that's the only hammer that they have right now, is to regulate your drinking water. So we're really cutting off this one pathway, but you're not doing anything about the rest of the pathways. So what are the potential regulatory actions? What could EPA do? All of these things have been talked about over the last few years as EPA has developed their PFAS action plan. So there are 2 sections under Superfund that they could go ahead and add, I guess, PFAS to. So they could characterize it as a hazardous substance, or they could add it to the section for joint and several liability, which wouldn't make it a hazardous substance, but basically would say that if anyone ever has to clean it up, then if you have 1 drop of it on a site, then all of it's your responsibility. They could create a maximum contaminant level, and there has been some talk of doing that, but as of the original plan was to set one in February 2019, and then they were going to set one by the end of 2019, early 2020. At this point, it doesn't look like that is imminent, so EPA just keeps punting that. They could add it to the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, so they could make it a hazardous waste, but they haven't done that yet either. But they did decide to add it they added PFOA and PFOS to the TRI reporting starting this year. So if you have any amount of PFOA or PFOS on your property, you now need to report that to the local authorities. So I think that's, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. That's where we are with this one. And so for me, that's all I've got. I appreciate everybody's time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here and thank you. And then remember, what I'd like people to do is just type in the chat that you have a question, and then you don't even have to say what your question is. I will ask you then to unmute yourself and ask your question. I have a few comments. One, that was fantastic. I was frantically taking notes here so I can steal some of this stuff from my lectures. Second, I've decided that I will retire to Pleasantville, New Jersey and drink some of the water that has pharmaceutical levels of Valium. And third, those of you students who were in either my hydrology class last year or Jeff Slaughter-Bettrau's politics class, politics and the environment class, the PFOAs, you may have noticed she had a slide up there, Parkersburg, West Virginia. That was, remember we saw the Dark Waters film and we had the Zoom with Bill Pullman and the lawyer he portrayed in that film. That was the contaminant that was the subject of that Dark Waters film. So I just wanted to remind some of you that were in those classes last semester. Okay, so Bill Miranda says he has a question. So can you unmute yourself, or do I have to do something?
I was given permission.
Okay, all right.
So my question was actually regarding Dark Waters. I wanted to know if you had seen the film and if you had what your opinion on the job that they did was, because we talked to, like Michelle said, we got to talk to a few of the people that were in the movie, including one of the lawyers. And I just wanted to know from your perspective, what you thought.
So I will admit I haven't seen Dark Waters. I have seen The Devil You Know, which is a Netflix special that is more of a documentary of the same same story, same town. And I kind of, you know, with Mark Ruffalo, I was afraid that they were going to Hollywood it too much. And so that was part of why I didn't actually watch that movie. But my understanding of how they moved through that process, and from what The Devil You Know takes you through all of the you know, it really is, it lends itself to a Hollywood thriller. And the research they did, the digging they did, the ability to, you know, get documents out of DuPont and be able to really truly understand it. I mean, I think Boyat was the attorney's name. I mean, the job that he did and the team that he pulled together was truly extraordinary. And, you know, it makes me so happy for humanity that instead of taking money and just walking away with $400 million and splitting that across, you know, the few thousand people in the town, that what they wanted to use that money for was a health study, so that they could document whether or not, you know, these chemicals were going to be an issue for other people moving forward. And the fact that that community decided to do that and decided to pay this forward and prevent everybody else from having these same issues. I mean, it really is just an extraordinary story, in my opinion.
Thank you. Derek Stark has a question.
Okay, my question was just in the timeline that you showed us, what was going on in the 80s and 90s, because we didn't get that information. I just wanted to know why that information was missing.
Yeah, I actually took those sections out because they kind of weren't relevant to this talk. But in the 80s and 90s, we were actually finding more and more uses for this. So particularly in the 90s, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration figured out that if you add PFAS to plating baths for chromium plating, that you actually reduce the amount of chromium that workers are exposed to. So all of a sudden, chromium plating became a significant user of PFAS, and that caused a lot of additional health problems. So I think it's important to note that, you know, in 1970, we knew, or at least the companies knew, that this was a human health issue, and they identified it in their workers. And for the next 20 years, we're still finding new and expanded uses for these chemicals and exposing more and more workers to them.
Okay, so they were kind of just like years where they were really going into the field, seeing what's going on with all this stuff. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, you know, I've talked to, there's a woman at EPA Region 3 who was the original emergency response person out in Parkersburg. I believe that was 1989, where she went out and she saw the cows, and, you know, and so there was a lot of internal struggle within EPA and within the scientists, where there was a general understanding that this stuff was not good, but they needed to develop the science and, you know, have the data to back it up to be able to regulate it. And it's kind of getting into the weeds, but with PFAS, that's particularly challenging because of how it acts in the human body is very different than the way it reacts in a lot of our laboratory animals. So PFOA and PFOS actually bioaccumulate in people. They don't bioaccumulate in mice and rats. So when we're trying to do our toxicological studies using those vectors as proxies for what happens in people, you have to give these animals so much PFOA and PFOS to get to the blood level concentrations that people have, that there are a lot of confounding factors. So it's really not known if it's the high dosing that's causing the health impacts in the rats and mice, or if it's actually the PFAS itself. And that's, again, why that C8 study was so important, to have human epidemiological data that they could hang their hat on, because there really is no good way to study the human health effects without having humans.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. Nicole has a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak to how it gets into the environment. Is it purely from the manufacturing side, or does it leach off of products that it's put into? I'm not. Like you mentioned that it's on fast food wrappers. Like, is there a threat that it's on your food at that point, or like how?
Yeah. So yes. You know, fast food wrappers are considered one of the you know, pizza boxes, popcorn wrappers. So any wrapping that is designed to resist water or grease is probably has PFAS in its manufacture. And that when you see that our food intake is an order of magnitude higher than our water, our drinking water exposures, that's really where that comes from. So in a lot of cases now, you'll see, you know, PFAS-free packaging advertised. I think there are a lot of manufacturers that are getting away from that. But anything that is prepackaged where you have to make sure it doesn't stick to the packaging. I'm thinking of granola bars, or like, you know, some of the sticky power bars. Like that kind of packaging has particularly high levels. There's also, you know, it's in ski wax, it's in a lot of cosmetics, it's in carpet cleaner. It's just, it really, there's such useful chemicals, they're just everywhere.
Okay, that's kind of depressing. Bill has another question.
So you had mentioned that the C8 study was really a turning point in how much we were able to get done regarding PFOAs, especially C8. Do you think that something like that would have to come about with every specific chemical if we really wanted to see fast-paced change? Or do you think that there's a better way to get a quicker response than we've seen in the past?
So what I've heard, so Linda Bierbaum was the head of the National Institutes of Health, and her proposed approach was to, and this is for PFAS specifically, was to group the 4,700 chemicals into functional equivalents. So in the case of PFOA and PFOS, they're both the same carbon chain length, and they are both, they're both protein philic. So they both will, when they get into the human body, they will bioaccumulate and they will attach to proteins. So her theory was find all of the types of chemicals that act in the same way as these, you know, PFOA and PFOS, and treat them or regulate them as one group. And then when you're, again, looking at other chemicals, you know, they'll if you read about PFAS, they'll talk about C6 compounds or shorter chain compounds. A lot of those compounds don't bioaccumulate as significantly. They're still not going to break down in the environment. They'll be there forever, but they are not as impactful of human health. And so if you can, again, group those together and treat them separately and regulate them separately. So it's more of that functional approach rather than an individual chemical approach.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask Jake Passmore. But before I do that, Russ Patterson posted a link in the chat that looks really interesting if people want to check that out at some point. But let me just ask Jake to ask our last question. Can you unmute yourself or?
I'm unmuted.
Okay.
So my question kind of goes along where Bill's questions were, but because they're so useful and we use them for all kinds of different things and they do what they're supposed to more or less perfectly, is that part of the, I guess, roadblock to actually getting them regulated, because we rely on them for so many different things and we don't necessarily have a replacement for them at this point, or see one coming soon?
That definitely is part of it. I've done a lot of advocacy through the National Groundwater Association, talking to Congress, talking to individual Congress people and folks that are actually in communities that are impacted by this. And I think the biggest thing we're struggling against is simplicity, right? So why can't we just ban all PFAS compounds, you know, all 4,700 if they're so bad? Well, then explain to your kid why they can't have their cell phone anymore, or explain why the satellite that we need to, you know, target our weapon systems doesn't work anymore. So like there are things that these compounds do that we can't replace, but that doesn't mean that we can't look at the largest uses and target specific replacements. So in the specific example of AFFF, or the aqueous film forming foams that were developed specifically for the military, there may be like on shipboard, we may not be able to get away from that product. That product may be with us forever, but there's no reason that that product has to be used everywhere at every military facility. If you have a facility where you can mix your firefighting foam with fresh water, you can probably get away with a fluorine-free product. And there's a lot of development that's going in. You know, the Department of Defense is spending a lot of time developing those products. So there are probably hard places where it would be almost impossible to replace these specific compounds. But if you target those places and you really work on your materials management structure around those, and you replace it every place you can, you know, the amount that you can reduce would have a significant human health impact.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. I think that's a really good point to end on, and for us to think about. So thank you very much, Seth. And we thank you all for coming. This has been, I think it's worked pretty well, and hope to see a lot of you next week when we have Martha Buckwalter Davis, who will be talking to us, class of, I don't know, 2006, something like that. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.